Welcome to the second in the series of 4 videos on being autistic, on double empathy and Chinese whispers, otherwise known as the diffusion chain. This is a myth-busting session, I guess. The myth that autistic people lack theory of mind, empathy and social skills, the myth that we are all boys, the current question as to whether or not there is a specifically female presentation of autism, and some mismatches of salience, marvellous phrase, you'll meet it in this session, that may crop up in the therapy room. You will have gathered from the first video that I don't have much patience with the medical deficiency model of autism, out with the actual diagnostic process, in which, naturally, that is the language that has to be used. I have noticed that there are starting to be assessments which also talk about strengths, which is promising. In the first session, we looked at language, person first or identity first, neurodiversity and neurodivergence, functioning labels, and levels of autism. In this session, we will be looking at some of the myths and stereotypes that still constantly surface, even in autism charities, in trainings, among the experts, almost everywhere where autism is addressed by non-autistic people, seen from the outside. The autistic community, and it is a community, has adopted the motto, "Nothing about us without us," because we have discovered that unless autistic people are there, front and centre, the stereotypes creep back in. Those stereotypes that we honestly thought had been discredited and refuted for good. That isn't to say all non-autistic people get autism wrong. Of course not. But even one of the really good guys, Steve Silberman, author of Neurotribes, among other things, said in a 2016 interview, "Listen to autistic and other neurodivergent people. Read books by them, follow their blogs and tweets, and talk to them in person. There is nothing like first-person perspectives to illuminate the experience of life for people who think differently," which is pretty big of someone who presumably would like to sell his own books too. Shall we have a quick look at autism from the outside, see what those myths and stereotypes are, and why, as it turns out, they are untrue or inaccurate? I am particularly fond of this comment by Chris Bonello, an autistic teacher, speaker, and author who posts as Autistic Not Weird. "I'm autistic, which means everyone around me has a disorder that makes them say things they don't mean, not care about structure, fail to hyper-focus on singular important topics, have unreliable memories, drop weird hints, and creepily stare into my eyeballs. So why do people say you're the weird one? Because there's more of them than me." The one that so many of us autistic therapists have come up against, and trainees whom I know are still coming up against, is that autistic people lack theory of mind, and therefore empathy. So what is theory of mind? The phrase originates in a 1978 article by Premack and Woodruff on chimpanzees. It is defined as the ability to attribute mental states to ourselves and others, serving as one of the foundational elements for social interaction. If you think about it, that is essential if we're going to experience empathy. If I don't know what a person's mental state is, or indeed that they have a mental state, then I can't empathize with their feelings. Most children can do this to some extent, apparently, by the age of 15 months. This is in an article in the Encyclopedia of Neuropsychological Disorders less than a decade ago. Most of us have a theory of mind in that we can guess what others are thinking and how that might differ from what we are thinking. Those with autism can be thought of as mind blind in that they cannot imagine what others might be thinking, or even that others are thinking. To them, it would be like looking at the headlights of a car to determine why the car just did what it did, or what information it is trying to convey to us. I hope that sounds as gobsmacking to you as it does to me. I know what my cat's thinking, never mind another human being. So deploy your theory of mind for a moment and think what it's like for a person to be handed this piece of information about the group to which they belong. And now imagine that person is a therapist, or worse, a therapist in training. A person-centered therapist, no less, working in a modality which is based on empathy. However, it's not enough just to say, that's rubbish. Spoiler alert, it is. For some reason, the burden of proof appears to be on us to demonstrate that it is. The main villain in the piece is not Leo Kanner or even Hans Asperger. It is Simon Baron-Cohen. Since 1985, his first article written with Leslie and Frith, he has been perpetuating his belief, based on very shaky foundations, more on that shortly, that autistic people are deficient in theory of mind. In that 1985 article, Baron-Cohen describes autism thus. Childhood autism is a severe developmental disorder. It is a rare condition affecting about 4 in every 10,000 children. The majority of autistic children are mentally retarded. There are two problems here. One, our definition of autism has radically shifted, but the stereotypes which grew out of the original definition have not. And Baron-Cohen is now, in the 2000s and teens and 20s, still trying to prove a thing about the larger group that he even failed to prove about the smaller. 2. There is no interest in autistic adults. You will have noticed the diagnosis of childhood autism. We now know that autism is a lot more common than Baron-Cohen thought in 1985, and we also know that most autistic people are not mentally retarded. We have Hans Asperger to thank for that. Yes, we have, as he was the one who first stated clearly that you could have autistic psychopathy. Sorry about the phrase. It doesn't mean we're psychopaths, just that he thought there was something up with our minds, who were not in any way intellectually challenged. On the contrary, he referred to the children that he worked with as little professors. You may be surprised to hear that Asperger's works were not translated into English until 1991. So maybe we can forgive Baron-Cohen for not being aware of them in 1985. Asperger's syndrome had quite a short time as an official diagnosis, just 20 years, from 1993 to 2013. Baron-Cohen began in 1985 by suggesting that the development of theory of mind may simply be delayed in autistic individuals. But by 2008 he was saying, mind blindness is universal in applying to all individuals on the autistic spectrum. I think my clients and my friends, neurotypical and neurodivergent, might beg to differ. So might my cats. Related to mind blindness, there is the stereotype that autistic people are deficient in social skills, specifically skills in social communication. We certainly seem to be in this neurotypical world, but that is only half the story. It would seem that we are not deficient in social skills as such, but we are deficient in neurotypical social skills, as neurotypicals are in ours. Neurotypical people understand each other better than they understand autistic people, and autistic people understand each other better than we understand neurotypical people. If you have ever seen a group of autistic people socializing, whether at Autscape, at a Scottish Women's Autism Network conference, or just casually, you won't need any more evidence that autistic people have excellent social communication skills, just autistic ones. However, about a year ago, Crompton et al. Published a study which demonstrates this very elegantly. It is based on the game which used to be called Chinese Whispers. I'm sure it has a different name now, but that's what we called it in my school playground. A group of people line up and one person whispers something into the ear of the first person in the line, who whispers what they have heard into the ear of the second, and so on. The last person in the line says aloud what they have heard. Usually it is significantly different, sometimes hilariously different, from what was originally said. You can look up the article for yourselves. However, I will quote you the abstract in full. Spot the deadpan autistic humour in the first two sentences. So here's the abstract. Effective information transfer requires social communication skills. As autism is clinically defined by social communication deficits, it may be expected that information transfer between autistic people would be particularly deficient. However, the double empathy theory would suggest that communication difficulties arise from a mismatch in neurotype, and thus information transfer between autistic people may be more successful than information transfer between an autistic and a non-autistic person. We investigate this by examining information transfer between autistic adults, non-autistic adults, and mixed autistic with non-autistic pairs. Initial participants were told the story, which they recounted to a second participant, who recounted the story to a third participant, and so on, along a diffusion chain of 8 participants. We found a significantly steeper decline in detail retention in the mixed chains, while autistic chains did not significantly differ from non-autistic chains. Participant rapport ratings revealed significantly lower scores for mixed chains. These results challenge the diagnostic criterion that autistic people lack the skills to interact successfully. Rather, autistic people effectively share information with each other. Information transfer selectively degrades more quickly in mixed pairs, in parallel with a reduction in rapport. So far the abstract. Well, well, who would have thought that two groups with different cognitive processing systems would find it difficult to communicate with each other? I've said that I feel a real kinship with Naoki Higashida, and I've quoted T. Monette saying that she feels a similar kinship with a non-verbal child having a meltdown. This sense of kinship is constantly reported. Carl Cameron comments that before his diagnosis, when he was working with autistic children, he preferred their company, and the company of other autistic adults, to that of the staff. He says, "Staff asked me how I built relationships and achieved the outcomes I did with autistic children who were considered complex or hard to reach, when no one else could. I didn't understand why I succeeded when others failed. After all, I didn't seem to do anything. Now, of course, I have come to realize it was because I did nothing. I didn't back kids into a corner with needless communication and interaction. I watched and worked with them when they were ready. I engaged by sharing interest and built bridges with them. Spoken language is overrated. You can do without it and still find mutual understanding. I later came to realize that I was the same as these children, and that we were the members of the same tribe." And that takes us to double empathy and the mismatch of salience, both phrases from Damien Milton, who is one of the most important autism researchers of our time. He happens to be autistic himself. I recommend Damien Milton's book, A Mismatch of Salience. It is a brilliant title, and incidentally, a brilliant book cover. Look at it twice. The title expresses perfectly those constant misunderstandings between autistic and non-autistic people, just as double empathy expresses the misunderstanding at the heart of the myth that autistic people do not have empathy. I'll give you a personal example of this mismatch of salience in a later video. Just making sure that everybody understands the phrase. It will depend on what your academic background or interests are, whether you do or don't. Salience is the quality that makes something appear important or significant. If I hear a client's presenting story, even more if I read it, I will not necessarily know which elements are most salient to them. I'm sure you've all heard a client say, and mean, something like, "My father left when I was 10, but honestly, that wasn't what had a major impact." Looking at their story, that might have been the first thing that leapt out at you. Salience comes from the Latin salio, I jump. But when they think of their actual life, the thing that jumps out at them is something quite different. That's a mismatch of salience, and that is why I am person-centered. Gestalt therapists also, as I'm sure you know, cultivate creative indifference. You do not know what is significant, salient, in your client's perceptual field. You have to wait patiently as that field, as they perceive it, becomes clear to you. When autistic and non-autistic people communicate, there is a constant mismatch of salience. I think the phrase I have used most in my life is, "That isn't what I said." Note, not "that isn't what I meant." It actually wasn't what I said. Chinese whispers. It is as if I said an absurd but clear example. This book is red, not blue. And what you heard, due to interference, a momentary lapse of attention, whatever, was, "This book is blue." It isn't what I said. It is what you heard. Emma Wishart has entitled her book about her life before her autism diagnosis, "But you said." On a lighter note, an example Damien Milton has given is the Two Ronnies sketch about 4 candles, fork, handles. He suggests you see Ronnie Barker, the customer, as the autistic person, and Ronnie Corbett, the shopkeeper, as the non-autistic one. But actually, it doesn't matter which way round you see it, which is in itself telling. They are apparently saying the same thing, and yet, if you don't know that sketch, may I suggest you Google it after this video? It is very funny and very pertinent. One of the very basic things that can lead to this mismatch of salience is what is known as autistic weak central coherence. That doesn't mean we have a weakness. It basically means that we are inclined to see details rather than the whole. This can be very useful. We are excellent proofreaders. My friends are astonished at the way I can find my way back to the car or the railway station in a strange town, using the landmarks, the tiny details that I have noticed on the way out. You mean you didn't notice that those 2 windows in that shop are slightly different sizes? But yes, it can lead to misunderstandings. An analogy might be that you and I are both looking at the countryside. You say, "It's so green." And I will look at you surprised and say, "It's red." You are looking at the sweep of the hills. I am looking at the poppies that surround the place where we are standing. Different ways of seeing, different ways of expression. Autistic people, this is a generalization, but it does seem to be largely true, often use body language, facial expressions, and tones of voice differently. This is even before the difficulty experienced by many of us in translating our thoughts into words. Here's Naoki on the subject. Sometimes people with autism speak with a strange intonation or use language in a different way. Non-autistic people can sort out what they want to say in real time while they are having the conversation. But in our case, the words we want to say and the words we can say don't always match that well, which is why our speech can sound a bit odd, I guess. When there's a gap between what I'm thinking and what I'm saying, it's because the words coming out of my mouth are the only ones I can access at the time. Those words are either available because I'm always using them, or because they left a lasting impression on me at some point in the past. Some of you may think we read aloud with a strange intonation too. This is because we can't read the story and imagine the story at the same time. Just the act of reading costs us a lot of effort. Sorting out the words and somehow voicing them is already a very tall order. Damien Milton is a good example of that. His voice is very level and his facial expression quiet and mostly unchanging. I find him extremely clear and relaxing to listen to because of the pace of his delivery and the lack of distraction. You might find him monotonous and stiff. Now, I think of myself as passing pretty well in that area, although it has been commented that my questions don't sound like questions, so I have been known to go question mark at the end of a question. And here is a story that suggests that I may be mistaken about passing. About a dozen years ago, I broke my arm. I rocked up at A&E and said, "I have broken my arm," probably exactly in that tone of voice. The triage nurse said, "No, you haven't." I blinked and said, "Well, I have actually. I felt it go." She said, "You can't have. You'd be in agony." I blinked again and said, again, almost certainly in the same tone of voice as I'm saying it now, "But I am in agony." She rolled her eyes and directed me to the back of the queue. I had, of course, broken my arm, but because I was not manifesting this in the expected way, it was not seen. So, just like double empathy, this goes both ways. I recommend that you read the original article on double empathy, but this is the gist of it. I have taken this largely from an excellent summary in non-academic language by Dr. Melanie Hayworth. There may be some duplication here, but I think those things bear repeating. Milton argues that autistic people experience the world and express emotions differently to non-autistic people. We communicate, experience and display emotions, interact with others, form relationships, and sense the world around us differently to non-autistics. That doesn't mean that we don't have emotions or feel empathy, but it does make it difficult for non-autistic people to understand and to empathize with us, and us with them. Autistic differences lead to different life experiences, which create a kind of empathy divide. So just as it could be said that autistic people lack social insight into non-autistic culture and communication, it could also be said that non-autistic people lack social insight into autistic culture and communication. Milton calls this disconnect a double problem, because both autistic and non-autistic people experience a lack of understanding for the other group. In other words, empathy is a two-way street. The empathy divide is experienced by both autistic and non-autistic individuals. But, as I suggested earlier, these groups are not equally affected by the divide. Because the non-autistic way of communicating and empathizing is the typical, expected way. It is accepted as normal and correct by most people. That means that the atypical, unexpected ways in which autistic people communicate and empathize are often rejected as different and incorrect. Milton suggests that many non-autistic people assume that their majority, familiar way of empathizing is superior or preferable to the autistic way. This perception has meant that non-autistic people often expect autistic people to learn non-autistic culture and communication. Indeed, autistic people are frequently given treatment plans to help them to understand non-autistic perspectives. That is, I'm afraid, still the main aim of most programs for children. But non-autistic people do not expect themselves to understand or learn autistic perspectives. An everyday example of a non-autistic lack of empathy for autistic experiences is the reaction from non-autistic people when we mention we are autistic. Often, the automatic response from non-autistic individuals is, We are all a bit on the spectrum. The non-autistic person's response is usually intended empathetically. It is meant to normalize our autistic experience. But this non-autistic response presumes that autistics don't want to be autistic, since doubtless the non-autistic person does not want to be autistic themselves. Rather than empathetic, then, this response is offensive to the autistic community, since it undermines autistic experience, authenticity, and identity. To the autistic recipient, the non-autistic person is displaying a social deficit or lack of empathy in not seeing the potential offence in their words. Autistic individuals say that in fact it is they who have been expected to make, and have actually made, the greater effort to understand the feelings of the non-autistic population. Milton says, "One could say that many autistic people have indeed gained a greater level of insight into neurotypical, non-autistic society and mores than vice versa, perhaps due to the need to survive and potentially thrive in a neurotypical culture. Conversely, the neurotypical person has no pertinent personal requirement to understand the mind of the autistic person, unless closely related socially in some way." The value of Milton's theory is that it reframes the disjunct between autistic and non-autistic communities. We don't need to think of superior and inferior ways of being. Instead, we can see our coexistence as reliant on reciprocity and mutuality. Autistic empathy is no less compassionate, no less thoughtful, no less human than non-autistic empathy. It is simply different. Since we are talking about empathy and myth-busting, I think it's worth saying something about the concept of the female presentation of autism. It is, and it isn't, a misunderstanding. You may be surprised to hear an autistic person being so nuanced. Surely either it is right or it is wrong. I don't think we can ever say that in the world of science, or arguably any academic field. For example, we recognise that autistic doesn't mean the same now as it did to Leo Kanner, or indeed to Simon Baron-Cohen in 1985. Yet we do have to acknowledge the importance of Kanner's description of a distinct syndrome, instead of previous descriptions of such children as feeble-minded, retarded, and all those words. Similarly, we have to acknowledge the importance of Hans Asperger's realization that some autistic people are highly gifted, even if we now realise that A, we aren't all boys, B, we aren't all savants, and C, Asperger's syndrome is simply autism without intellectual disability. Just so, the concept of the female presentation of autism was a huge leap forward. It meant that people who didn't present in the typical male way, bear with me on this for the moment, could also be diagnosed. The concept of autism has been stretching and changing ever since Kanner and Asperger. And while we now look back at so many things and think, that's wrong, we have to acknowledge that each step was less wrong than what came before. So we build on the not quite right but not quite wrong theories that precede us, which is why our understanding is always being tweaked and nuanced. There isn't time here to go into the details of the various theories, such as the female protective effect. Is testosterone a risk factor for autism? For which, so far as I can tell as a non-scientist, the evidence is minimal. Or the similar extreme male brain theory of Simon Baron-Cohen, yes, him again, which has been repeatedly discredited. Yes, it may well be that boys are more inclined to systematize and girls to empathize. But the reason is not some mysterious difference in neurology, for which so far no evidence has been found, but a not at all mysterious difference in socialization, for which evidence is all around us. We now know that what was described as the female presentation of autism is simply a presentation of autism, more likely to be found in people who have been socialized as female, not necessarily because they are female as such, but because that was how they were socialized. I suspect that a trans woman who was socialized as male is less likely to present in that so-called female way because it is about socialization. A person born female and identifying as female is the most likely to present in that way, and incidentally, the most likely to remain undiagnosed, as there is such a strong societal pressure to conform to the gender we identify as. The reason why it is important to be aware of this different presentation is precisely because people presenting in this way are much more likely to miss out on diagnosis. I don't have the figures, though the diagnostic rate is currently 3 or 4 males to 1 female. But women are certainly more likely to be diagnosed late in life, and so miss out on support at school and university and adjustments thereafter. And because they are not aware of the origin of their difference, they are more likely to believe that, if they are bullied at work, abused in relationships, struggle to find and keep employment and all the rest, it is their fault. They are irretrievably broken, mentally ill, and profoundly wrong in their very being. Because the diagnostic criteria are based on children socialized as boys, they are not always recognizable in people socialized as girls, much less in women. One of the diagnostic criteria, for example, is repetitive movements. The stereotype is spinning, rocking, or flapping. Instead, a child socialized as a girl is more likely to do something more socially acceptable. We might twirl our hair or hum or wriggle and be perceived as girly or cute. Another really obvious example is the special interest. The stereotype is that the special interest will be around science, chess, IT, computer games, maths, and of course that perennial favourite, the train schedule. Girls may well have those special interests, but their special interests may on the other hand be ponies, fashion, boy bands, because that is what is expected of them. Mine was, and still is, traditional song from various countries. Looking back through my life, the only thing that has changed is which country or area. What started in Spain continued to Naples and travelled through Hungary, France and Wales, before settling, for the moment, in the Gaeltacht of Scotland and Ireland. Not what you'd find in a diagnostic handbook. And indeed, I was missed. It was clear that I didn't fit in and that I struggled. But because I was intelligent and in some ways very articulate, nobody asked why. Would I be missed were I a schoolgirl now? Who knows? It is true that some girls do present in the so-called male way, and they are the ones who are more likely to be spotted. As Kieran Rose says, women do not experience different autism. They experience different prejudice. There is still far more pressure on girls, and indeed women, to conform, to be good, be quiet. It is hardly surprising that girls are more likely to camouflage, more likely to experience internalizing problems such as anxiety, depression, and eating disorders, and less likely to have externalizing behaviors such as hyperactivity or impulsivity and conduct problems. While boys are more likely to act out, girls are more likely to be perceived as quiet and anxious. Similarly, in later life, women are more likely to be diagnosed with mental health problems and personality disorders, while the underlying autism, which may be a huge contributory factor to their difficulties, is missed. It seems to me that although the concept of an actual female phenotype for autism is problematic, not least in the context of our growing understanding of gender as more than a male-female binary, it remains essential to bear in mind, for reasons which have not yet been fully clarified, an autistic girl or woman may present very differently to an autistic boy or man. Note, and this is important, that we are talking about outward presentation here. Once we start looking inside, start looking at the person's actual experience, for example, their perception of the mismatches of salience and the double empathy problem, their sensory issues, their cognitive style, the difference all but vanishes. Finally, for this video, here are some suggestions based on an article by the Autistic Research Collective as to how the double empathy problem may manifest itself in a therapeutic setting, and some examples of misunderstandings that may occur. This could equally well have been in session 4, but it fits here too. It isn't natural for most autists to hold eye contact. The way most of us explain this is that it takes enough effort to listen to and understand what somebody is saying without also having to concentrate on eye contact. You may notice quite a few of us looking at your mouth. Yes, we're lip reading, even if there's nothing wrong with our hearing. The movement of the mouth gives us additional information as the eyes do not. If an autistic person also curls up in the chair and wraps their arms around themselves, our postures tend to be non-standard, a therapist could easily mistakenly think that we are disengaged or even defensive. Actually, we are concentrating, soothing our anxiety, or simply getting comfortable. I quite often need to let my neurotypical clients know that if I look away or close my eyes, that means that I'm concentrating, not that I'm bored. I don't need to tell my autistic clients, they know. We also don't naturally waste effort on facial expression. In the non-autistic world, a person who is not looking at you and has a neutral facial expression is interpreted as not engaging, not interested. It may actually mean that an autistic person is risking dropping the camouflage. We may misinterpret your facial expressions. We are very ready to assume that we have done something wrong. If we see anger or distress on your face, that is probably the conclusion we'll jump to. As I mentioned earlier, many of us have non-standard tones of voice, monotonous, jerky, breathy, or crackly. That means nothing at all, except that it is our natural way of speaking. Because the neurotypical social world is a bit of a mystery to us, we may carry what we understand to be social requirements into the therapy room. We have been taught to ask social questions, to show interest in the other person. It is not natural to us to do that, and we may be clumsy. We are not trying to break boundaries, simply being friendly and maybe camouflaging. Non-autistic therapists might assume that if we are persistently late due to transport-related anxiety or difficulties with planning, these are therapy-interfering behaviours or signs of resistance or unwillingness. They are, in fact, probably due to sensory difficulties or executive dysfunction. Please don't correct our ways of speaking. We are almost certainly not trying to be rude. Assume that we mean well unless you have evidence to the contrary. We will do the same for you as far as possible. Bear in mind, though, that many of us will have suffered at the hands of non-autists. We may experience a non-autistic therapist's body language, for example, leaning in with intense eye contact, as threatening or intrusive, or simply so distracting that we lose our concentration or even our words. In general, slow down. Most of us process slowly. If we are faced with a lively, very cheery, very in-your-face therapist, most of us will feel we've been left behind before we even started. This is a similar point. Please try to see our point of view and the reason why we are thinking or speaking as we are, before suggesting an alternative, probably neurotypical, way of being. A very obvious example is that if anxiety is caused by sensory overload, no amount of CBT or of thinking differently is going to help, any more than it would help with a broken leg. We are so used to being told that our way is wrong. Please don't reinforce that. Take time to understand. As Carl Rogers said, the best vantage point for understanding behaviour is from the internal frame of reference of the individual himself. So maybe bring the double empathy problem into the room. Acknowledge that you and your autistic client have different processing systems, different neurotypes, different cultures, different languages. Acknowledge that misunderstandings are going to happen, that they are nobody's fault, and that understood misunderstandings, if I may use such a phrase, may be one of the most powerful forgers of relationship and mutual understanding. I hope that this video has successfully busted some of the myths. The next session will be about what it is like to navigate the world as an autistic person.